Well, congrats to everyone who made it through turn. Now take a deep breath and just rest for a second. Okay, now let's talk about your lease-up plan for 2020. Isn't it crazy how quick we have to change gears in the student housing industry? So seriously, what's your plan? What's your plan for renewals? What's your digital strategy? How are you going to get in front of more international students? How are you going to leverage social media? What is going to get students' attention this year? Every marketing plan for each property is going to be different, but one thing that should be consistent in every marketing plan is listing your property on Unilodgers. Why? Because Unilodgers has a 10-year history and an infrastructure for getting in front of more international students than any other listing platform. Another reason why, unlike other listing services, you don't pay a monthly listing fee and have no guarantee of an ROI. You only pay Unilodgers a fee once a student moves in. Not sign a lease, but once the resident has actually moved in. So what is there to lose? Visit the link in the show notes or go to unilodgers.com/contact-us. That's UNILODGERS.com/contact-us. And get your property listed today. Welcome to the Student Housing Insight Podcast, where we are putting you in touch with the people who bring student housing to life. I'm your host, Wesley Dees, and today I'm being joined by one of our new co-hosts, Dr. Philip Batazuski. How are you doing, Dr. B?
Thanks, Wes. I'm really excited to be here and be a part of the podcast. Thanks for having me.
Well, you are a veteran of higher ed administration since 2005, and we asked you to be on the podcast this year in order to provide that on-campus perspective that we feel is so vitally important for our audience members who are typically site level and regional level managers of purpose-built off-student housing communities that are supporting universities not only across the country, but across the world. And just thank you so much for agreeing to come on as a co-host and tackle a lot of important subjects for us this year. We had you at our Waco Summit presenting with a couple of other folks. I can't wait to actually put that out on the podcast for everybody to hear about building bridges between off-campus and on-campus folks. And again, just thrilled that you're here.
Thanks, Wes. Yeah, I'm excited to share the on-campus perspective with the off-campus folks. It was great to be there in Waco and meet some site-level folks from the Southwest, especially since I'm up in the Northeast. We wouldn't necessarily run into each other.
Well, as you mentioned, you are in the Northeast. You live in Buffalo, but you've kind of been all around to different institutions. Why don't, just for our audience members, get them familiar with your background and your origin story as it relates to higher ed administration?
Sure. So I grew up in Buffalo, actually. So it was a return home, even though I've been gone for quite a number of years. I did my undergrad up here at the University of Buffalo and then ended up moving to Ohio and did my master's at the Ohio State University. I'm a very proud Buckeye, even though I wasn't born in Ohio, which is either going to make the listeners love or hate me. So I did my master's there and spent a couple of years working there full time before I moved south to the University of Georgia and did my PhD down there, working in housing as well. I'm slightly less, but only slightly less of an avid Bulldog fan, depending on people following college football. It was a rough football weekend for Bulldog Nation. We had a rough week. Here's hoping for a turnaround. And then spent some time after that at the University of Pittsburgh, moving north. Then I moved even further south down to Florida, where I met our guest on today's episode or on this episode. And then just recently, back in April of this year, moved back up to Buffalo. And I currently serve as the Assistant Dean of Residence Life at Buffalo State College, which is part of the State University of New York system. We are actually the only urban centered institution in SUNY, which means that we're smack in the middle of Buffalo. We've got about 27 to 2,800 students that live on campus with a 2-year housing requirement. We do have some purpose-built off-campus student housing that is right adjacent to campus. So I spend some time working with those folks on my own campus, in addition to the fact that obviously I'm talking a little bit from the on-campus perspective.
Well, great. Yeah, thanks for getting everybody kind of up to date on your background. You and I have been talking since early spring about you coming in to helping us out with this, and I've actually been on the website for several months, but we wanted to, the first one kind of out of the gate that we wanted to do, and there's 2 good times of the year to do it typically in the academic world, which is March, April time frame, and then once again in September and October, and that's the discussion on mental health. I know that it's something that, especially on campus where you've got most of the freshman population that is living on campus, such of a critical time as they're transitioning, from living with mom and dad into, being responsible for a lot of things on their own. And some of the pressures that go along with that really bring a lot of things to the surface in regards to mental health. And so I wanted to make sure that we were doing something when we introduced you along those lines, and this made the most sense. And so you mentioned the guest that we actually interviewed for this podcast some time ago, and gave me a little bit of his background. I'm like, that's perfect. This is exactly the type of person that our audience, needs to hear from. So why don't you really quick just kind of introduce who the speaker is for the audience and give some background, and we'll jump into the interview.
Sure. So we both spoke with Dr. Kirk Dougher, who currently serves as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Support and Wellness at Washington University in St. Louis. You'll hear him tell a little bit more about his background. He's been in the mental health, counseling, wellness field for even more years than I've been working in higher ed and in housing. And he and I were colleagues when we were both working down in Florida. He was in the counseling wellness area. I was running housing. And interestingly enough, I transitioned institutions, and then about a month and a half later, he was also transitioning institutions. So we've both left Florida, but he's bringing a wealth of knowledge on how to not only work with and do actual counseling of college age students, but also, I think, for our audience, is bringing information and perspective on what things they can look for in students living in their communities, how they can talk with the staff that are working with the students most closely on warning signs, and how to refer, and even how to connect the student back to the campus that they're already attending. It's not about creating some counseling center off campus. It's really using the resources of the campus that already exists to support the students living in the community.
So yeah, I echo everything that you're saying, and like I said earlier, this is the perfect person that our audience should be listening to, because you're going to talk a lot about, in the episodes that you co-host, about building relationships with the university and how that can be done. And someone in Kirk's position is not necessarily someone that an off-campus housing manager may be able to come into contact, on a day-to-day basis. And great if they can. I certainly encourage everybody to seek out whoever's leading the mental health and counseling services for your university. But to be able to spend some time and really kind of understand what Dr. Dougher goes over today is not something that they have a lot of time, necessary to give to someone. So I think this is a perfect podcast for those that have been in student housing for a long time, as well as for, those that are certainly new to the industry and want to have a better understanding of kind of what's going on, especially through the academic cycle, and how that ends up affecting mental health of students. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get in the interview. I do want to say, make sure that you are because here at Student Housing Insight Podcast, it's not just about interviews, but we are actually working with our partner, Grace Hill, to develop a training that we're going to be presenting in a webinar on November 7th. So we'll get into more of that in the outro. So make sure that you stick around for that. But with that being said, here is Dr. Kirk Dougher.
Dr. Dougher, thanks for joining us on the Student Housing Insight podcast. Dr. Dougher currently serves as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Support and Wellness at Washington University in St. Louis. Thanks again for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So to start us off, before we get into the meat of our conversation, can you give us a little rundown of your history in the field?
Sure. So I have a PhD in clinical psychology and have spent my entire career in academia. My first roles went through a number of different postings, including the academic side of the house, where I was a full tenured professor, and moved on to a position as counseling center director. And I have since that point held positions very similar to the one that I have now, where I oversee student health, counseling center, pharmacy, relationship and sexual violence prevention, WashU Cares, which is a kind of a care or behavioral intervention team. I've also overseen other offices like campus recreation and the accessibilities departments. So my role kind of encompasses all of those kinds of contents currently.
Keeps you busy, at least.
Very much so.
Dr. Dougher, I appreciate you coming on and helping tackle this discussion on mental health as it relates to students. And, one of the things that we really wanted to be able to provide our audience, which is mostly off-campus housing professionals, both at the site level as well as the regional and the corporate level, is really just kind of get your insight on some of the things that we should be looking for as far as signs and that type of thing. But before we even really get into any of that kind of stuff, I really just wanted to get your insight, because you've been involved at several different universities, and this has been your forte as far as with counseling. But tell us just a little bit in regards to the resources that universities have in place for not only housing managers that are serving the campus and the surrounding community, but also for parents and anybody that's kind of coming into daily contact with students of a particular university.
Sure. So obviously the primary one is going to be the counseling centers, and nearly every university, community college, or institution has some variation of a counseling center located on their campus. There are a couple who have decided to outsource. I'll mention that here just briefly, but counseling centers at the university typically are striving to be able to provide mental health services for the students that attend those universities and community colleges, but on a short-term basis. In other words, they are not designed to be able to work with a student on a long-term issue that might go on for a protracted period of time, nor are they designed for high-intensity work. And so most of the counseling centers are going to be able to see students for about 5 to 10 visits in any given iteration of therapy. And those centers are typically set up to be able to have students walk in at any point and be able to have an emergency session if they need it, to be able to have an emergency triage. But then there can be some wait times. And that's where some universities have moved to off-campus service providers, because they will have a lot of master's level clinicians that provide services, and they're really focused on just getting students in and getting them therapy. One of the disadvantages of going that route is that a counseling center is also designed to be able to provide additional services to the campus community, including some workshops, some training, some outreach where they try and educate the campus community about mental health related issues and things that can be done. And this is also true for their involvement in housing. So it's not uncommon for both on and off campus housing providers to reach out to the counseling center, requesting that they come over, sometimes provide some seminars or educational experiences to those entities so that they can assist with their understanding of the current trends or processes in mental health, and also to educate them about how they can get students in to see somebody in a crisis fashion in the counseling center. Lastly, I think I would also add that most counseling centers also have some after-hours providers, meaning that if somebody was to call, and it's typically the same number that the counseling center uses during the daytime, if they were to call that during after-hours time, they are usually connected to either some of the counseling center providers themselves or an after-hour call service. So quite typically at most universities and community college, they have some availability of being able to speak to a therapist 24/7.
So you and I, Kirk, probably know this better, working on a college campus, but you mentioned as you were answering Wes's question there that on-campus counseling centers are typically not designed for long-term care. Can you talk a little bit about why that might be?
Yeah, so, at any given university, there are varying needs that a student might have coming into the counseling center. And really, those centers are designed to try and keep the students performing at their academic utmost. And those are usually meaning that the students will present with short-term issues. And the most common presenting issues over the last 20 years have been anxiety and depression, with anxiety being on the rise and depression remaining very high, but kind of plateauing at this point. Further treatment that they might, individuals that are attending school might seek, can result in a high demand for resources. And the counseling center just don't have enough people to be able to staff those kind of resources. And so typically they'll refer those out into the community for additional treatment. So it's a way for the university to be able to provide for the needs of the students as they go through some transitions at the university, but for long-term treatment, for things potentially including substance use issues, eating disorders, other kinds of things where there's a need for a higher frequency, intensity, or duration. They're typically going to refer off campus for those service availability, and that way they can keep the cost to students for the number of student health fees and other kind of ancillary fees down to a manageable level.
So it's not so much that they'd be refusing to see them so much as using the resources that they have wisely.
Correct. Yeah, there's been an increase in the frequency of risk and kind of crisis presentations at the counseling center, and there's always a push and pull between, do we try to see all the students that want to come in to see us, especially those high risk and crisis cases, or do we want to be able to see the students for the entire protracted duration of their mental health needs? And quite honestly, most universities at this point are edging towards the side of making sure that they can see students who are in crisis as a primary type of service that they provide.
Well, Dr. Dougher, you mentioned earlier, I think, high intensity or high impact type situations, and you were talking just then about crisis situations and being able to see those students. For the off-campus crowd that may not exactly know the definition behind that and what constitutes a crisis situation. Can you give us a little bit more of an idea of what that means?
Sure. So by crisis, most of the time that we're talking about it at a university and community college, we are talking about students that are coming in that pose some sort of danger to themselves. And so that can mean that they are engaging in behaviors that might look like self-harm. They could be cutting or hurting themselves in some ways. And it also reaches all the way up to a student who has some kind of suicidal ideation or intent. And those students, obviously, we want to try and make as safe as possible with the fewest number of people. So when we're talking about risk or crisis situations, usually we're discussing students that are coming in presenting a danger to themselves.
So I think, I feel like probably most the general population probably understands what that looks like. And certainly at that point, when things are being said, when they're getting reports from roommates, being able to listen to what you said earlier as far as what the university typically provides and how they can get to those resources, I think that's helpful. But is there anything that you can share with us that may be precursors isn't the right word, but are there any other kind of, less intense, less high risk type of behaviors that a property manager or even a roommate may be able to see and say, okay, this may be the start of something. Because obviously you guys would like to be able to counsel a student at that point versus to the point where they're at risk of harming themselves or someone else. Is there some guidelines that you can kind of give us as to, hey, here are some common things you should be looking for?
Absolutely. So, some of the red flags that housing managers might try and attend to are the same that you would look for in other types of contexts. So while these are not new, but alterations, especially significant alterations in either direction in somebody's eating, sleeping, or exercise pattern could be indicative of them struggling. So sometimes students will sleep more or less than they normally do. However, those can be difficult to be able to recognize. So alternatively to that, what we're seeing in the college-age population currently is different strategies for self-medicating when they're not feeling good. And by feeling good, I mean they could be struggling with depression, they could be struggling with anxiety, or a whole host of other kinds of things. And that self-medication takes a really broad range of manifestations, from the traditional ones that we might think about where they're drinking kind of to numb the pain. But that's not exclusive to that kind of response. So a lot of our students will do things like play video games, Fortnite and others, for extended and very protracted periods of time. Others will start to see social isolation and disengagement from friends and other kinds of activities. In still other situations, as innocuous as it might sound, students could be reading novels or watching Netflix for hours on hours just to be able to try and help alleviate some of the fear and anxiety and discomfort that they might be facing. So those strategies of self-medication and isolation, especially when they weren't present initially, would be some things that as a housing manager I would want to be paying attention to.
So, and again, you're talking about more of shifts in behavior. I mean, if it's kind of their routine of playing, 2 or 3 hours of video games, but all of a sudden that, not even all of a sudden, but maybe over a period of several weeks, that ends up going from, 2 to 3 hours to 6 to 7 hours, and they're even skipping class. Is that the type of shift that we're talking about?
Absolutely. And I think the piece that you mentioned there last is really key. When some of their responses to their mental health needs or their sense of struggle starts to impact their outside life. In other words, when they start missing classes, when they start kind of default missing activities, responsibilities, not going to work, other kinds of things certainly would be a clue to that. Or when they start to become sick quite a bit. Increased frequency and kind of duration of sickness or fatigue can also be signs that they're struggling.
So let me kind of break this down to what I would see a manager, how they would get a housing manager, how they would get kind of word of this. It typically comes from a roommate, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And I think this is why it's so important as an on-site manager, both yourself and your staff, especially your maintenance team who is going into the units to change air filters and other, simple repairs, ongoing repairs. It's so important to make sure that you're having an interaction and, just kind of a basic awareness of, what the students are doing. I think especially for our maintenance staff members, that's huge because, you're the ones that are always, fixing the problems and you're able to see them not, inside the community clubhouse and that type of thing, but you're actually seeing them in their element in their own apartment. And, being able to notice those type of things or be able to have a conversation with a roommate, either in their apartment or when they come to the administration office and saying, and just having that general conversation of, hey, how are your roommates doing? How's John doing? How's Sally doing? Whatever. And being able to pick up, when that roommate says, he's not going to class anymore. I don't know what's going on with him. Like, that's a key indicator. So walk that property manager through once they get that notification from a roommate that something, and it could just be general conversation, right? But somewhat, you feel like it's a sincere observation by that roommate and they've got some type of worry. Walk a manager through what it is that they should be doing at that point to try to get that student some services? Is it going directly to the parent? Is it further investigation with the student? Is it going to the university through some type of anonymous reporting system? Walk through what you would feel like is the most appropriate.
Absolutely. So on campus, as you're pointing out, those that have the most frequent contacts with students are often the ones that are in the best position to be able to notice some of those discrepancies and changes in them. For, in the academic environment, it's obviously going to be their professors and teachers. If they're in an on-campus situation, their residence hall advisor is going to be well positioned. And as you're talking about off-campus, it's certainly going to be their resident managers and some of their maintenance staff that have frequent contact with them. So if they're able to observe changes in, their appearance, changes in the apartment, to have frequent contact with roommates and others is a really key and critical component. So if they have those kinds of pieces in place where a roommate then steps up and says, hey, I was noticing that my roommate is, and it goes on to describe some symptoms that are disconcerting for that roommate. Probably the best next step is to spend a little time with that reporter and ask them additional questions to try and get as comprehensive of a picture as possible about what's going on. And because there are lots of different explanations for behavior, I would suggest that the next step would be actually to have a conversation with the person of concern directly and say, hey, we've heard that your behavior has changed in the following ways, or that somebody is concerned about you. And some of those can be difficult to be able to navigate, because sometimes those reports come into the property manager and the roommate says, hey, don't tell them that I told you this, but, and then they go on to describe the symptoms. And so sometimes the property manager is going to have to be very thoughtful about the degree to which they disclose informations and where that the origin of that information, in order not to break the trust of the roommate that came to them in the first place. But having a conversation with the student of concern would be the primary thing that I would recommend next. And therefore, therein you can gather more data about what's going on with them, how long this has been happening. And typically people are very receptive to somebody just saying, hey, I noticed something was going on with you and I'm worried about you and I'm wondering what you can tell me about what's happening. And based on the outcome of that conversation, then a number of different resources could be engaged in at that time. And some of those might include, sitting with that student and saying, hey, are you aware that there are counseling resources on campus? And would you like to sit with me and call over there and make an appointment together? Sometimes that's enough for them to be able to initiate that process. Other times the behavior might be so disconcerting that the property manager may feel a strong need to be able to report through, and there are typically, again, at most universities and community colleges, a anonymous reporting line, typically found connected through the Dean of Students website. And you can go on there and they have availability of putting them in anonymously. And that information is fairly quickly disseminated to various individuals on campus who have a responsibility of caring for that student. And they're likely going to become aware of that and try and marshal a number of different resources to connect the student with some care. If it's even more disconcerting, where they have a plan and some specific intent, in looping in parents and even local authorities, police in particular, can be really important at that time. If somebody has a deliberate plan and the property manager is afraid that they have intent to be able to carry it out in relatively short order, the immediate next response needs to be a call to 911 to make sure that the appropriate authorities who have specific protocols and specific ways of responding to that are notified, so that we can keep that student as safe as possible.
So let's talk about the habits again, because there's something there that, as we were talking about that, something that may be a little bit more negative. But I'm also wondering, I've seen a lot of students over my career that end up having some more obsessive type habits, but it's, I would say, providing, at least on the surface, a positive impact where, maybe they were overweight and began losing weight, or maybe they were decently in shape, and then all of a sudden it goes to a whole nother level where, they're working out 24/7. And, it's still one of those things where they may actually be skipping class in order to go on a 13-mile run.
Right.
Would you consider those type of change in habits just as alarming as something that may be a little bit more, docile in nature, or a little less, I guess, viewed as, I think most people would view it as being negative or being withdrawn? Maybe they're going the other way, where they're super involved with something that could be changing them physically. Is that something that we should be aware of as well?
Absolutely. So it's typically not the form that their escape and avoidance takes. It's the function that it fulfills. So while we can look back and say, obviously that somebody becoming very disheveled and unkempt and not taking care of themselves is a bad thing, in the same way that we would say that overutilization of alcohol and not being thoughtful about that as a mechanism of self-medicating is a bad thing. There's a lot of good, productive things that function in a very problematic way for our students as well. So you mentioned students might turn to working out a lot more. And while that might have a benefit, it also is a problem. And believe it or not, a student who throws themselves into studying incessantly, that could also be indicative of a problem. So it's not what they're doing, it's why they're doing it. And if they're doing it to try to not feel badly, over the course of time, from a psychological point of view, that's going to serve as a distinct disadvantage, because whatever they're doing to escape or avoid those emotions or those experiences is typically still going to be there at the end of the long run, or the reading of many, many assignments, or any of that kind of stuff. And the emotional difficulty returns back to them. So part of what they're trying to do is using escape and avoidance strategies to try and numb psychological pain, when in fact that psychological pain can return back in a heartbeat. So it's not necessarily the overt benefit or deficit of what they're doing, it's the function that it's having for them psychologically.
Gotcha.
So we've talked a little bit about how to potentially, identify issues on the front end, and then when something is brought to the attention of a property manager or a staff member, how to refer folks. Kirk, you and I have dealt with a number of students that have needed more intense care, and so they may have been hospitalized for a short or long-term period, but we aren't removing them from the institution. And so at some point they're going to come back to school, and then they're also going to come back to their place of residence, off campus in this case. So I'm wondering, are there things that property managers, maintenance staff, even if if the property manager is connecting to the roommates in the apartment, are there things that they can then do on the back end to be helpful when a student is returning perhaps from a hospitalization, or even if they went home for a brief period of time but never withdrew from the institution?
Yeah, certainly. So institutions typically have some form of a medical leave of absence policy that they have in place. Additionally, when a student goes into the hospital, those hospital facilities will take care of them and make sure that when they release that student, that they are deemed to be functional in the environment. So property managers could rest assured that if they're released from a hospital stay, that they have gotten the care that they need, to where the issues that took them into the hospital initially are not as acute as when they're discharged. So they're no longer a danger to themselves, for example. So one of the things that they can do is, as that student returns, obviously they're trying to get reinitiated back into a routine of attending classes and so forth. And the initial return to the residence is often fraught with some difficulty, trying to get established and making sure that any of their food is there, any of the payments that they missed have been attended to, and so forth. So a property manager, I think, just would do the same thing with a student that they might do for a friend. Just check in on them and say, hey, how are you doing? Be aware of the circumstances that they might be going through and welcome them back. I think some of the concerns that students have when they're returning from medical leave of absence is that people are going to treat them differently or be afraid of them in some way, when in fact that's a time that they just need more empathic and listening ears to be able to help smooth that transition back into their academic process. And students are often quite successful at returning to their university endeavors on the heels of a transition, either from home or from a hospitalized setting.
And I know some institutions have some protocol on campus that a student has to follow as well, regardless of what the discharge from a hospital facility might be.
That's true. That is absolutely true. And typically those transition plans may require them to meet with officials on campus, sometimes deans of students, sometimes counseling centers, other folks that might help connect them to resources. And typically what they're trying to do is just make sure that the student's doing okay and that they're aware of the resources that they can utilize on campus.
The one other thing that I wanted to make sure we came back to as well is earlier you mentioned that after hours care is often available via the counseling center in some form, right? You're calling the same number as during the business day and it's connecting you to some after hours resource. If that either doesn't feel like the right call, or maybe for whatever reason, the counseling center near a particular campus doesn't have that available, what are some places that make sense to look in the community after hours?
Certainly, there are almost always after-hours community providers that have access to resources. But even more importantly, there are national suicide hotlines that can be called. And so regardless of what it is that the community has or doesn't have in that environment, then in some instances, it's a 411. Some instances, it's a 711 call, depending on the community and the resources that they have. But invariably, there are national resources that someone could assist a student in making a phone call so that they can get some of the services that they might need.
Kirk, one of the things that this is kind of on my mind, and when I was on site, as well as I certainly noticed what I'm about to ask you, and then certainly overseeing a large portfolio, I always had conversations with my managers of, hey, this is kind of the time of the year when a lot of these things with students begin to manifest or come to the surface. In my own household, the holidays are always tough because there's people that we've lost, and you begin thinking about people at that point in the time. So we're all a little aware of, hey, we know this is going on, and each year we kind of think about this. Let's kind of attack this head on. But I think for students, I think that is following some other cycles. I think holidays are certainly play a part in it. But do you see that from your experience, or is that just something that I've noticed from the off-campus world? But these things tend to have some seasonality to it when these type of things manifest. Can you shine a light on that, or is that something that I'm just observing that isn't really there?
No, absolutely. I think that's accurate. And what I'd say is the general category of when those things tend to be manifest or more acute tend to be in times of high stress. And so for our incoming freshman population, certainly their first few weeks of the semester, when they have a higher proclivity to be homesick or to be worried about the transition that they're going through, they don't have a lot of friends, and that can be an extremely stressful time. Midterms, also a stressful time. Finals, a stressful time. But as you mentioned, holidays also impact our students. In some ways, the expectations of very engaged parents can be stressful for them. Other times they have come from a difficult home life, and the thought of returning back to home during a Thanksgiving or a holiday break could be very stressful to them as well. And so we tend to see them fluctuate with that kind of a calendar. So in the springtime, the same kinds of issues show up in reverse: midterms, finals, and then for our graduating cohorts, as they anticipate moving on to positions or looking for a job or struggling with finding employment, those can be very stressful times as well. For the cohorts that are not graduating, what are they going to be doing for the summer, and the transition into internships, returning home, other kinds of things often can be quite provocative. And so as a housing manager, you want to be attending to what the academic calendar looks like, but also those traditional times of elevated stress. And you'll be able to witness those in terms of the students' sicknesses and other kinds of things, physical, mental health, or otherwise, that tend to manifest themselves during those timeframes. So paying attention to the time of year and the calendar that the institution functions off of is a really good plan, because you can start to see those elevations.
Thanks. Yeah, that's all of that makes sense, right? Because all of those are stressful times in a student's career, right? And I think the question that I'm wanting to ask is, because I think we're all familiar enough with what the academic cycle holds. But if it's something that falls outside of, kind of the typical, midterms, finals, and holidays, is it typically a sign of something that's not academic related? Maybe it's a boyfriend girlfriend situation, that type of thing.
So other kinds of things that housing managers might want to attend to, or that don't typically follow the academic calendar, would include personal issues that are going on with the student. Sometimes they've gone through a difficult romantic relationship breakup. Sometimes they might be having trouble with financial aid or other kinds of employment where finances are concerned. Additionally, family stressors back home also will impact a student to where they might feel that they are struggling with both their academic course load and their family-related issues. And so while there tends to be times that have more acute intensity for a student based on an academic calendar, certainly the things that impact everybody's daily lives can certainly impact students as well. And so to be able to be attentive and engage with a student throughout the academic calendar often leads to much better results, and an awareness of more finite changes that could occur that, if caught early, would reduce the degree to which it impacts the student and subsequently the community.
So, Kirk, the institution that I'm currently at and then one that we worked at together are both incredibly diverse institutions, particularly as you look across race, ethnicity, and in both cases, a lot of first-generation college students. I'm wondering, are there any specific things that our listeners should be looking for if they, are thinking about the makeup of the campus that they're near, and if there are any cultural or kind of family-related things that we should be paying attention to that might be different depending on what the demographics look like at a particular college or university?
Yeah, so certainly each campus has a very different makeup and feel. Each institution that each of us have been to certainly changes how that feels. So it depends on the campus. If it's a more of a rural campus, especially where there are first-generation students who are coming to college as the first person in their family to be able to do so, there are going to be different stressors that impact those students, and certainly the same kinds of things that hit family issues are going to be problems for students who come from kind of more selective institutions. Academic calendars are going to drive them really hard. What we're seeing a lot is students that really struggle with a lot of intensity and pressure from what they perceive as parental expectations. And sometimes those are accurate perceptions and sometimes they're not, but parents are not always having those conversations with their kids about what it is that they find to be important. So the institution that a student might be attending can dramatically impact the student's mental health, depending on what it is that the values of that institution foster and the type of population that they're trying to serve.
Kirk, as we talked about in my intro, I currently work at Buffalo State College up in Buffalo, New York, and we have a large population of students that come to us from the New York City region, and the majority of them are either African American or Hispanic, Latino, Latina. And I know that in talking to a number of them, there's some pressures from family around seeking mental health services and feelings like maybe I should be able to figure this out on my own. I don't need help from somebody else. Asking for help from somebody else makes me kind of less than, or it's just an additional barrier that I hear our students talking about. And so I'm wondering if I'm a property manager near Buffalo State, for example, or I'm a property manager at an institution with a large, diverse population, what are some extra things that I might need to think about when working with those students and referring them to resources?
Yeah, it's a great question because populations that are coming from international locations or have a particularly varied background, especially our underserved populations, are going to be having different approaches to mental health. And some of our international populations especially have an aversion to that, and they're more likely to be willing to seek services at a health center for a number of different issues. One, sometimes they will consider those to be real doctors. And two, it's easier to present at a health center and to be able to suggest that, hey, I've not been feeling well. And even the way that they've not been feeling can often be very physiologically manifest. It can be showing up in their heart rate, their breathing, and other kinds of things when it's a sign of anxiety. But it's easier and more comfortable for them to be able to present at the student health center. Student health centers are typically really well trained to be able to recognize some of the mental health issues that are going on. So if a student is inclined to be able to seek services that way, as a property manager, I would be encouraging them to do so. If they're not comfortable going to the counseling center, or if they have worries about how well the counseling center does or doesn't represent the various identities that they come with, then finding a mechanism for them to be able to get some form of help is really encouraging. But to be aware that different cultures, different backgrounds, and different populations have some varying levels of comfort and sensitivity in engaging with mental health service providers. So that's a very thoughtful thing to be able to do as a property manager.
So as we get you out of here, Kirk, I'm wondering if I'm listening to this and I want not that, logging on and listening to other student housing insight podcasts isn't a great idea. But if I'm looking for more training, more resources, maybe a conference or something like that, where might I look as a property manager to get more information about how to help my students with mental health or referring to resources?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think that there are a number of resources on campus. So the first thing I would encourage property managers to do is to turn to campus resources and reach out to the counseling center. Let them know who you are and what you're doing. And they are typically seeing the students that are living in those residences and would be very helpful in trying to either provide additional information, pamphlets, booklets, phone numbers, contact information, as an initial resource. So first thing I would suggest is to reach out to the counseling center. Second thing, if you don't have a counseling center and or you've already done that, then there's certainly national websites, the Institute of Health, National Alliance of Mentally Ill, and a number of different resources that you can Google online to be able to find out different ways of being able to treat issues. I would probably also encourage property managers to utilize resources that they would seek in their community to be able to find services as well. So a number of different hospitals have mental health service outreach, and there are resources that the counseling center can also direct you to about the off-campus providers and mental health resources that exist in the community as well. And those are always good places to be able to start.
Well, Kirk, we'd like to thank you again for taking the time to chat with us and provide some insight for our listeners, and really appreciate the time today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
All right.
Again, Dr. B, I appreciate you extending the invitation to Dr. Dougher and having him on the show. That was a great interview. I think there were a lot of things that people can take away, but to go over a couple of quick takeaways, that you and I picked up on, mm-hmm. I really liked what he said about, approach this resident, as far as presenting resources like you would anyone else that's kind of part of your broader community, or maybe even family members when you're noticing something. There's obviously every community has something, be it, national hotlines or something more localized that can serve as a tool in helping get that person the help that they need. And just realize with a student that you've also got this extra layer of support and with what is available on campus and the tools that are available there with their counseling services. So I thought that was a really good perspective. What other takeaways did you have?
I agree, Wes. And one of the things that I picked up on is what you just mentioned, is that, building relationships, and that's a lot of what I'm here to talk to folks about, is making sure that you don't see yourself as separate from campus, that you're building relationships with folks on campus. So this is a great opportunity before you're in the midst of a crisis, for lack of a better word, that you reach out to either the dean of students office or the director of the counseling center, and just to, right, you're not reaching out to do a sales pitch. It's a, hey, this is who I am. I'm managing this community across the street. Just wanted to make sure that you could put a face with a name in case we ever encounter a situation with a student, or using that relationship to even either tap into a training that they already do or get them to come out and do a training for the relevant people off campus. Where it's the same as on campus, right? I have a staff of resident assistants who are undergraduate students, and I have full-time staff as well. They go through training every year, and it's not about them being trained to be a mental health provider. In fact, it's absolutely not that. It's about knowing the signs to look for, and then how to best approach the student, and then connect them to the resources on campus. Just because you're off campus doesn't mean that it can't look the same.
Well, yeah, and I will park training there for just a second. I want to come back to that, but to get back to your first point, as it relates to building those relationships, you've said it before. I preach this constantly: is you can't wait for an emergency, a tragedy, something of urgency to try to develop these relationships. You're going to be able to respond a lot quicker, not just to mental health issues, but anything that has to do with the resources that an off-campus housing provider is going to be able to utilize from the university. And, it's, like I mentioned earlier, jumping in to see the head of counseling for your university may not always be something that you're thinking about, when everything's running smooth, right? But it is something that you need to check off the list, and just make that introduction, like you kind of described before. And if you're not able to get into all those specific departments and resources, at least make sure that you've got a great relationship with the dean of students and the office of student affairs, because those are the folks that can make those referrals and introduce you to those people when something does come up. Because as you and I mentioned previously, when it comes to being a university administrator and getting a request from somebody, outside of the university, there's a, I don't want to call it hesitation, because there's a duty there, especially when it comes to providing services to a student, regardless if they live on campus or off campus. There's a duty that professional will respond to, but there's also, at least on a subconscious level, there's this thought of, okay, why is this person asking me to do this? Is there something else going on here that, that I'm not aware of, maybe with the roommates? And, there's this kind of doubting thing that happens, in our brains anytime we meet anybody new, but especially as it relates to our work life and people that are kind of outside of our organization that get introduced and requests are made, right? And being able to at least have that introduction, that referral introduction from the dean of students to that head of counseling services, it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, that there's no ulterior motive, that, you're reaching out truly because you've got a student in your community and you're in need of assistance and resources.
Exactly. So that they know that, okay, this is coming from, probably their boss in a lot of ways. And it's like, okay, this has the blessing. There's obviously a relationship here. These guys are our friends, and we need to do what needs to be done for this student. Right. So I can't encourage people enough to make sure that you're consistently building relationships with folks at the university. And I know, and at the same time, I know it's tough. You've got leasing objectives that you're trying to meet. You've got people that you're trying to train on the sales process, and everything else, and it's a lot of work. But this is something that you've got to work into kind of your monthly schedule of meeting and networking with university administration, because you never know when you're going to need to have a conversation at that point in time. Introductions, it's just much more difficult at that point. So to get back to what you were saying about training, Yes, it is. It's always one of those things, regardless if you're on campus or off campus. If you're providing training for an RA or a community assistant, as it's commonly referred to in the off-campus world, I don't think any of us want to train. We don't want to expose ourselves to training them on how to counsel. That's not the purpose of providing training on mental health to your staff. It's really about identifying patterns and behaviors and just signals so that you can say, hey, I recognize that and I think I need to tell somebody about it. And, as I mentioned in the interview, our maintenance staff plays a very big key role in doing that. And, to share from a personal standpoint, one of the first hugs I ever got from a mother of a resident was actually due to, there was, her daughter was bulimic, and how it kind of came to our attention is the maintenance supervisor, who was doing quarterly inspections, noticed something in the bathroom that he had dealt with his sister, who was bulimic, and came to the property manager and said, "Hey, I know what this is, and we need to call the mother or someone because this is not going to end well." And fortunately, that property manager that I was working for at that time, because this was very early in my career, she had a brief conversation with roommates and tried to not seem nosy, and then that prompted enough that she wanted to call the parent. The mother came in. Some other things were happening right at that time. I can't remember exactly, but she ended up in the resident ended up in the hospital. And then a couple of weeks later, the parents came to move her out, and the mom stopped by. The daughter was not with them when this happened, but the daughter stopped by, asked to see the property manager, and she hugged all of our necks, including the maintenance supervisor, and said, "I just want to thank you guys so much for being alert and giving me a call, because I don't think if you called me that day that we would be having this conversation, or it would be a much different conversation that we were having today." And so we just never know, what is truly happening in everyone's life, and to be able to have a staff that can, because in that situation, he only recognized that because he had a family member that dealt with that same illness. If it wasn't for that, I don't know what would have happened. So that's why I say it's very important to either work with your university to provide your staff with some training on that. I know most, and Dr. B, agree or disagree with me on this, but I feel like, at least in the experiences that I've had, most directors of housing for on-campus housing, most of them are very open to setting up something where they can provide a similar type of training that they do for RAs to the housing staff as well when it comes to these type of things. Is that typically the case that you've seen?
Absolutely. It's using the resources wisely. If it's, if, like you said, it's typically a community assistant off campus and a resident assistant or resident advisor on campus, but we're talking about very similar job responsibilities. It would be very easy to add, a handful of extra community assistants into an RA training session, or even a number of RA training sessions, and just further build relationships, because chances are they're also students at the same institution. So they could be a community assistant and a resident assistant, and they're in the same major and in the same classes. They're just doing the same job, just in different places.
Yeah. Well, speaking of training, we're going to give you guys an opportunity, give the audience an opportunity to, in the Student Housing Insight community, we're going to give you guys an opportunity to be able to provide your staff with something that we're working with Grace Hill on developing as it relates to mental health and being able to identify issues and what resources with the university that you can use. This is something that will be built into the Grace Hill system. So if it's something that you want to use later, if you're a subscriber to Grace Hill, you're going to be able to use. But this training is completely free. It's a webinar that we're going to be doing on November 7th at 1 o'clock. And if you want more information, the best thing for you to do is go to studenthousinginsight.com. Again, studenthousinginsight.com. Go to the member login. If you're not a member already, sign up to become a member. And we will be announcing all the details within the Student Housing Insight community. There will also be a link to that in the show notes. So make sure you check that out as well. Well, Dr. B, I appreciate it. Anything else that you'd like to share with our audience today?
No, they'll hear from me again soon if they log on to that webinar in a couple of weeks.
Well, great. Well, I appreciate it. Again, welcome to the Student Housing Insight podcast, and we look forward to talking more to you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.